Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Assassin's Price by L. E. Modesitt, Jr., narrated by William Dufris. Prelude. At a quint before eighth glass, a chill early autumn wind blew through the covered courtyard. Two men stood at one end, one young and wearing a tailored greenish-gray woolen jacket and matching trousers with black boots, the other gray-haired and wearing the black and green uniform of the Chateau Guards. The younger man looked disgustedly at the man-shaped targets 10 yards away, then turned. Half the time the namer-damned pistol doesn't fire straight. Charyn glared at Guard Captain Cherwell. If I'm more than 5 paces away, it's unreliable. I've even brought a carpenter's vise out here and tried it. Lord Charyn, that's why I suggested. I don't want to use a blade. If I'm ever attacked, it will be at close quarters, and I likely won't be anywhere near a saber or any sort of blade. I need a weapon that fits inside a jacket and that can fire several shots. The guard captain was silent. Isn't there anyone in Lexcelsis who can craft an accurate pistol? You've tried all of those who now make pistols. Who now make them? Is there someone else who did or could? It's said, only said, that Factor Modesitt used to make the best pistols. Used to? Is he dead? No, sir, he doesn't do that now. How will that help? It's the best answer I can offer, sir. You've tried pistols from every factor in Lexcelsis who makes them. You've found none of them satisfactory. Then we'll go see Factorius Pacert. Now. Now, sir? The factor may not now. I'll meet you outside the stables in half a quint. We'll worry about what he may or may not wish later. Yes, sir. Charyn ignored the guard captain's thinly veiled consternation and walked swiftly back to the chateau. Less than a third of a quint later, he was striding into the stable yard, wearing a riding jacket of the same greenish-gray as his trousers. His riding gloves were gray, and he wore a gray visor cap without insignia. Cherwell was waiting, with 2 mounts and 2 chateau guards. "Where is Pacert's factorage?" asked Charyn. "On the West River Road, north of the barge piers, sir." "Thank you." Charyn mounted the chestnut stallion. Once the 4 riders were on the ring road that circled the Chateau d'Erex, heading south toward the Avenue de Commercia, Charyn turned to Cherwell, who rode on his left. "What else do you know about Factorius Pacert?" "He is said to forge devices for all manner of other factors. A tool-maker of sorts, then." "More than that, it is said. But I do not know more than I have told you." "Why do you know about him?" "Upon occasion, those in the chateau have had need of his services. He created the locks for the strong rooms when the old ones failed. I also believe he created the framework in the kitchen that allows the roasting of many fowl at once." "That seems rather a descent from making pistols." Cherwell did not reply as Charyn turned the stallion onto the Avenue de Commercia. "Don't you think so, Cherwell?" pressed Charyn. "I believe more people need special locks and other items on a day-to-day basis than pistols, sir." "He must be quite clever if he can give up pistol-making and do better." Charyn knew what he had paid for the pistols with which he was displeased. He also wondered if he had embarked on a fool's errand just out of anger and frustration. But just what was he supposed to do? His father didn't like him hovering around and asking too many questions. His father's ministers were afraid to tell him anything without his father's approval. His father had expressed displeasure when he had mentioned talking to any of the Army High Command officers, and he had read most of the readable and applicable books in the chateau library and a good portion of the archives. And he had to admit, it irked him that Cherwell could apparently aim either a rifle or a pistol at anything at any distance and seemingly hit whatever it was with no discernible difficulty. "I suppose he must be, sir." Despite the heavy riding jacket and the leather riding gloves, Charyn was definitely feeling chilled when he guided his mount onto the West River Road and headed south. Not that he should have been surprised, given the steamy trails created by his mount's breathing. "That's it up ahead, sir. The brownstone building on the left, with the one pier out into the river and the smoke from the chimney." At first, Charyn found himself looking at the barge piers, farther south, which protruded from the river walls and seemed anchored to them. But then he shifted his glance to the factorage, although he could barely see the smoke rising from the main factorage chimney, especially since the faint grayish haze was immediately blown toward the river once it was a yard or so above the top of the chimney. He rode almost to the door, dismounted, and then handed the stallion's reins to the nearest guard. Charyn hurriedly dismounted and followed the heir. Charyn knocked on the solid and aged oak door. No one answered. So he took the big brass knocker and slammed it as hard as he could against the knocker plate. Twice, and then a third time. He stood back and waited, his breath steaming in the cold air. He was about to hammer the knocker a fourth time when the door opened. A wiry, gray-haired man, wearing stained brown leathers, looked at Charyn, then to the guard captain. "Given the insignia and the number of chateau guards, and your age, you must be Lord Charyn. Now that you've interrupted everything, you might as well come in. You too, guard captain, but for your own safety, please don't touch anything." Charyn had to admire the factor for his immediate understanding of the situation and his calmness. "Thank you." Charyn stepped forward. "If you don't mind, Factorius." "Perfectly all right, guard captain." Persirt stepped back, leaving the door open. Charyn stepped through the doorway and into the factorage, surveying the interior, then gestured. Charyn followed, closing the door behind himself. The factorage was larger than it had appeared on the outside, and there were several forges spaced against the side wall, all in what amounted to a huge stone-floored hearth. One had an enormous bellows attached to it, although that forge fire appeared to be cold. Another was clearly hot and boiling something, because Charyn could see wisps of steam. "If I might ask why you are here, Lord Charyn?" The factor's voice remained calm. "I heard that you forged the best pistols in Solidar." "That is kind of you to say, but I don't manufacture pistols anymore, and I don't intend to again. Doing so was a mistake." "Might I ask why?" "It's time-consuming. You don't get paid what that work is worth, and the better it is, the more likely someone is going to get killed. It also ended up taking far more time than I'd ever intended." Persirt smiled politely. "There are several factors who produce excellent pistols. What's wrong with their work?" "None of them are accurate." The balding factor laughed. "Lord Charyn, with your resources, if you can't find a pistol that is accurate, the problem is most likely with you and not the pistol. Most likely you're pulling the trigger and not squeezing it. Or you may not see as well at a distance." "Then you won't make me a pistol?"
"So that you can get as upset with me as with the others?"
Persirt shook his head.
"Whether I agree to make a pistol for you or not, you won't be satisfied, and I'd rather work on more productive efforts."
For a moment, Charyn was taken aback, but he had to admit that the factor was likely right about making Charyn dissatisfied. Even so, it took an effort for him not to lash out. Instead, he forced himself to nod. "What might those be?"
"I make the parts for mining engines."
"Mining engines?" Charyn hadn't the faintest idea what an engine was, let alone a mining engine.
"They power the pumps that lift the water out of the mines."
The factor shook his head.
"Come, I'll show you a drawing of one."
"You don't have one here?" asked Charyn, as he followed the factor to the drawing board set before the window, but slanted so that whoever drew had his back to the light.
"They're rather large. I'm working on a way to make them smaller. You can see here a drawing of the pump and the engine."
Charyn looked at the drawing, but it didn't make much sense to him.
"That's different from making pistols, in some ways. I've always worked to fine tolerances."
The factor pointed to the mid-sized forge. Set over the white-hot coals was a sealed kettle of some sort. From the top of the kettle a metal tube ran to a cylinder, hung by a thin rod from an iron pot-holder. Thin streams of steam issued from the sides of the cylinder as it rotated. Charyn studied the cylinder and realized that the rod was not turning with the cylinder. He also could not see any steam escaping from the cylinder except from the small conical nozzles at each side. He looked to Persirt.
The steam makes it turn, doesn't it?
That's the whole point.
Just turn a cylinder.
No. Others figured that out some time ago. I'm using that cylinder to test the seals. Too much steam escapes in the present mining engines.
The factor pointed to a small assembly sitting on a smooth and spotless workbench.
Look at the second model here. The steam pushes this piston back and forth, and the rod attached to the piston turns the crankshaft that turns the wheel. It could turn something else, anything from a large turning bench or to power a loom in place of a water wheel.
The water wheels do fine, and the water is free. Wood, charcoal, coal, they all cost money.
There are many places where the land is too flat for that. Also, a larger version could do other things, such as Gellhorn uses a treadmill with an ox to operate a ferry. The treadmill turns a shaft attached to a paddle wheel. A larger version of this could do the same thing.
If you could even afford to build one, Charyn pointed out. If an ox works, why build this steam pusher?
Oxen get tired. You have to feed them. You could also use the engine, I prefer to call it an engine, to move a flatboat upstream or make it go faster downstream.
How much faster? Asked Charyn, intrigued. 1.
Good morning, sir, offered the duty guard to Charyn as the heir approached the door to the Rex's official study.
Good morning, Myrtle. With a smile, Charyn held up a hand.
Not until the glass chimes. Myrtle raised his eyebrows.
He doesn't like it if I'm early.
Or late. As soon as the first chime of 8 sounded, Charyn nodded. Myrtle turned and rapped on the door. Lord Charyn, sir.
Lorian's response to the guard was inaudible to Charyn, but Charyn had no doubt it was short and perfunctory.
Thank you,
murmured Charyn as he opened the study door and stepped inside. He closed it quickly and walked toward his father.
Waiting until the last moment again, I see,
growled Lorian. You did say as the chimes strike, sir. Charyn smiled pleasantly as he took the middle chair of the 3 facing the golden wood desk. The Rex's study was dark and gloomy, with the only real light coming from the 2 oil lamps in the bronze sconces on the wall behind the golden wood desk. The light did not carry except faintly to the large oblong conference table at the west end of the study, where occasionally the Rex met with either the High Council or the Council's factor of Solidar, if not occasionally both of the councils. The wind continued its low moan outside the chateau. From where he sat behind the desk, Lorian lifted the sealed envelope that rested on the desk, likely delivered earlier that morning by a guard or a courier.
This just came. It can wait for a bit.
He set the envelope down.
I received the accounts on your Charol lands. Minister Alastar says that over the past 3 years you've done well in managing it. He doesn't know how.
I went up there and talked to the tenants, sir. They suggested I let them try potatoes. Alastar had limited them to maize or wheat corn. I did, because everyone else around there is growing wheat corn. Potatoes brought more.
How much more?
Lorian's question was almost a formality, as if he didn't really care, but felt obligated to ask. Around 2 parts in 10 more. That was conservative. In 2 out of the 3 years since Charyn had been gifted the lands, the increased return had been more like 4 out of 10 parts. He had not only collected the rents personally, but kept track of the harvests. Some of the extra return might have just come from his closer oversight, but he had no way to know. He had only put half of rents into the strongbox that was his in the family strongroom, since Alastar kept ledgers on each property. Even so, he'd had to use considerable ingenuity to keep a rather significant amount of golds hidden, and that was worrisome. At the same time, he didn't like the idea of being totally beholden to his sire, not when Lorian might live another 20 years, or at least 10.
That's good, but don't start to think like a factor.
Lorian coughed hoarsely, covering his mouth with a large kerchief.
Half of those that grow things spend more time at their exchange, or whatever they call it, than in doing what they should. speculating on what price wheat will have 3 months from now, or maize, or flour. Not even the Nameless knows that. And the high holders are worse in their own ways, always moaning about how the weather makes it hard to pay their tariffs."
Charyn nodded, then watched as his father, with hands that had come to tremble more and more over the last months, opened the envelope. Just from the silver-gray sealing wax, even Charyn could tell that it had to have come from High Holder Rael. Lorien, without so much as another glance at his son, murmured,
"Yet another trial,"
and offered a heavy sigh as he began to read. Several more sighs followed. Knowing that his father would only snap at him if he asked the nature of this particular trial, Charyn kept a pleasant expression on his face as he waited. Finally Lorien looked up.
"The absolute gall of the man."
He glared toward the window to his right. Charyn wondered why he bothered, since neither of them could see it, frosted as it was on the inside, even behind the heavy hangings. Although the sun had come out, it wasn't that warm, even if winter was almost a month away, by the calendar anyway.
"You read it,"
said Lorien, handing the letter across the desk to his son. Charyn took it and began to read. 8 Ernton, 408 A.L. Your Grace, I trust that this missive finds you and all your family in continued good health as we approach year turn, and I offer my best and heartfelt wishes for prosperity in the coming year. You had asked that I request another year's extension of my current term as head of the High Council. As you well know, I have already served in that capacity for a full 6 years. During that time I have seldom left Lexcelsis, and then only for the briefest of periods because of personal travails, notably the early and untimely death of my only son, Bariel, from the red flux. These past years have been a time of change and of great stress for all, and in consideration of the difficulties we have faced, especially at your suggestion a year ago, last Ernton, I requested from the other councillors a year's extension of my term as head of the council, because I did not wish to be considered for another 5-year term. They were gracious enough to grant that extension. What were they going to do? Thought Charyn. Deny it when both the Rex and the Maitre of the Collegium wanted him to stay? Much of my family has scarcely seen me for the past 6 years, and this has placed a great burden on my lady in dealing with Bariel's children and all the duties of administering the holding. I trust you can understand my desire to return to Rivage. Charyn had forgotten that Bariel's wife had died after the birth of her daughter Iriela, and that Bariel's death left the High Holder and his wife as guardians of the holding's heirs. Also to be considered is the fact that another extension of my term would be seen as very much against past practice and tradition, and might well generate unrest among those high holders who have already expressed great concerns about the changes that you and the Collegium Imago have implemented and continued to pursue. Charyn knew what Rael wasn't saying, that the High Holder had no desire to be associated with the additional changes, and that if he stayed, he would be forever marked as a tool of the Rex and the Collegium. But then, isn't Father already a tool of the Collegium? Why should he alone suffer that burden? And for these reasons I would suggest that it would be best for all concerned that you allow the High Council to choose another head of the Council for the next 4 years, either from the remaining members or from other qualified High Holders. If not before, Doriana and I look forward to seeing you at the year-turn ball, as do, I am certain, all the other members of the High Council. Charyn lowered the missive.
"Well?"
asked Lorien in a tone that was barely less than a bark. He doesn't want to preside over another increase in tariffs, and over any more limits on the powers of the High Holders. He also likely does truly want to leave Lexcelsis.
So he can plot from the relative safety of Rivage? That's what he wants. That's what he's always wanted. He doesn't want to tell all those high holders who complain every time the weather turns bad that the weather is always bad part of the time, and that they still need to pay their tariffs.
You don't think that he worries about his grandson?
The only worries he has about those children is how he'll use them to gain power. Cariel is 14, and Ayala is 11 or 12, something like that. If it weren't for your mother, he'd have been making overtures to marry her to you.
Why not Barin? He's closer in age.
Because Barin won't be Rex. Rael's always been after power. He was behind pushing my late and unlamented brother to lead the High Holder revolt because he could influence Ryantar.
Charyn wasn't about to let his father rage on about his ungrateful brother, or more about Rael, who was, unfortunately, his mother's scheming brother. At times it was hard to reconcile the warm and seemingly kindly Uncle Rael who had once presented him with new minted golds on special occasions when he had been barely old enough to remember those events. You haven't told me if you and Maitre Alastar talked this over, and if the Maitre had anything to say about Uncle Rael leaving the High Council.
No, I haven't. As you could see, if you even thought, I just received the message early this morning.
Charyn again had to suppress his desire to snap back. I have a thought. Just a thought, sir.
Spit it out.
His missive emphasizes that he doesn't want to be chief counselor any longer. He also says that it would be a bad idea for him to continue in that post and that he would like to see his family more, doesn't it?
He just wants to go off and plot.
But that's not what he wrote. You can act in terms of what he wrote rather than what he may have in mind. What if you agree that his time as chief counselor should come to an end?
Absolutely not.
Sir, might I finish before you make a judgment? There's more that you might find to your liking.
I doubt it, but go ahead.
You agree that his time as High Counselor should come to an end, but in order for there to be continuity and a smooth transition, he should serve the next year as just a counselor, and that he and the other counselors should choose the new chief counselor from the current counselors. That way, he would be free to occasionally travel to Rivage and see his family, but his options for plotting would be limited and much more likely to be discovered while you still have him under some measure of scrutiny. That way, you also can portray yourself as somewhat sympathetic to his concerns.
I don't know.
Why don't you talk that over with Maitre Alastar? Tell him it came up in a family discussion.
Why not say you thought it up?
Because it's better that it be seen as less specific. Either Mother, me, Barin, or even a Loriana could have suggested it. If you do it that way, rather than suggesting it was your idea or mine, the Maitre is more likely to consider whether it is a good idea or not on the idea itself, rather than whether you came up with it or I did. Charyn smiled self-deprecatingly. He might think it a bad idea, but how he answers might suggest other possibilities. Charyn had the feeling that was about as much of a comment as he was going to get on that, and he eased the missive back onto his father's desk. When do you meet with the Solidar and Factors Council?
Not until the 18th of the month. That's when I meet with both the High Council and the Factors Council. That meeting will be a little more than a formality. The meeting in Ianus will be where everyone tells me what's wrong and what I should do that they don't wish to pay for. That's soon enough. Too soon.
Are the Factor Councilors still opposed to the High Council's proposal to forbid excessive interest rates?
No one has told me. Since Factors will do anything for gold and hate to pay even an extra copper for anything, I imagine they are.
Charyn nodded. What about the expansion of the Regial post roads?
I almost wish that Maitre Arion hadn't disciplined the Imagers in West Isle by making them build roads.
Weren't the roads to Leontiago in terrible shape? Didn't they need rebuilding?
They did, but now the Factors around Est Isle want better roads, and the Imagers building the new branch of the Collegium there aren't established enough to do that yet. The High Holders away from Lexcelsis and Leontiago are complaining that they can't get goods and crops to markets quickly, and that they're suffering from an unfair situation.
That made sense to Charyn, because in the years immediately after the failed High Holder revolt, the Collegium Imago in Lexcelsis had improved and widened the post road all the way to Caphria, as well as sections of the river road from the capital to Solis, and the roads north from Lexcelsis to Rivage. I thought the stone roads in Old Telerin were still in good condition.
They are. Most don't lead to the larger cities or ports.
Aren't the regional governors supposed to supervise post roads?
They claim I don't give them enough gold for all the work that needs to be done."
Lorien shook his head.
"There probably isn't, after what they pocket."
"Maybe—" Charyn immediately broke off his words, then added smoothly, "Perhaps as you replace each regional governor, you should make it clear that certain roads need to be repaired and improved, and that such repairs will determine in part how long they serve."
"They'd just steal more until I caught them."
Charyn was afraid that was true as well, but wanted to keep his father talking, in hopes of learning something he didn't know. What about an additional tariff on the banks, the exchanges?
"A plague on the banks and exchanges. They're what led to the revolt. Trading crops and debts and everything instead of producing. Speculation. Bah!"
Charyn nodded but did not move. He had learned early that patience was a necessity in dealing with his father, and most people. Close to a glass later, he left the study, nodding again to Myrtle as he did. He was headed toward his own chambers before his other appointments, when he passed Aloriana's door, just slightly ajar. "Oh, no, no!" Charyn was struck by the distress in Aloriana's voice, and since her sitting-room door was indeed ajar, he knocked and pushed it open. "Are you all right?" Aloriana was straightening up as he stopped in the doorway. "Oh, it's you. Thank the nameless it wasn't father or mother." Aloriana's eyes did not meet Charyn's. "Oh?" Charyn could see that Aloriana held something silver in her hand. He thought he saw bluish gems as well. "Did you drop something?" "Oh, nothing." It didn't sound like nothing. Charyn waited. "It's just a hair clasp." "Is it broken? Maybe I can fix it." "Thank you, Charyn. I'll take care of it." Aloriana immediately turned away and hurried into her bedchamber, closing the door behind her and leaving Charyn standing alone in the sitting-room. Charyn couldn't help wondering what she had broken that she didn't want him to know about. Finally, he stepped back into the corridor and gently closed the door to the main corridor. He thought he heard sobbing, but he was far from certain. 2. Charyn was waiting in the receiving parlor of the Chateau de Rex on Mardi morning when the footman appeared and announced, "Ferrand de Delcourt Alt has arrived, sir." "Please show him in." Charyn rose and waited. Ferrand appeared. He was perhaps several digits taller than Charyn, with the blond hair, gray eyes, and narrow face that ran in that branch of the family. Unlike Charyn, he had unblemished skin and a weak pointed chin. He wore a dark green riding jacket and trousers, with gray boots that were polished, but not enough to disguise the fact that they were well worn. He inclined his head as he entered the parlor and stopped. "How are you, cousin?" asked Charyn. "I'm near destitute, and I'd have few enjoyments at all if it weren't for you." "Let's not talk about that," replied Charyn cheerfully, lowering his voice and adding, "Not here." Then he said, his voice louder, "The weather's not the best, but I need to get out of the chateau. I'd hoped you'd join me on a ride through the hunting park. You could take the gelding you've ridden before." "I suppose I could manage that." Ferrand grinned. "Especially since your invitation was to go riding." "I do try not to surprise people. Not my friends, anyway." Charyn gestured. "Shall we go?" He turned and headed for the north center door to the chateau, the one that opened onto the rear courtyard, at the back of which were the Regial stables. Neither young man spoke beyond pleasantries until they were mounted and riding away from the chateau across the ring road to the west, and through the old wrought-iron gates in the stone wall that bordered the western edge of the ring road, and out into what remained of the hunting park that dated back to before the times of old Bavaria. 2 guards with rifles followed at a distance, far enough back that quiet conversation could not be overheard. Charyn guided his chestnut onto the gravelled northern path that headed toward the bare-limbed woods that were not so well tended as they might have been, then turned in the saddle toward Ferrand, riding on his left. "How is your family these days?" The same as it always is." That meant that Ferrand's father was spending too much, his mother drinking too much, and his sisters worrying about who would even consider a match with them. "Sorry to hear it," replied Charyn in a voice meant to be both sympathetic and dry.
What about yours? As you said, the same always. Father worries about both the high holders and the factors.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?